And people have conferences in Kyiv talking about retaking Crimea and regaining the Donbass. This is delusional. It is inspired not by a desire to protect Ukraine or Ukrainians, but by a desire to inflict pain on Russia.
Delusional negotiations in Kiev. Well, that's probably not the only thing that the ambassador says in the following interview that might raise some eyebrows. Charles W. Freeman Jr. is a retired US career diplomat. He had a distinguished career in the State Department as Undersecretary of State and Defense and as US Ambassador to Saudi Arabia during the Gulf War. His career is marked by his expertise in Middle Eastern affairs, Chinese policy, and his more than candid commentary on US foreign policy. In the last interview with the ambassador a couple of weeks ago, we focused on the Israel-Palestine conflict, and what he said then must have resonated because within days some of the shorts we produced were viewed more than 2 million times on various social media channels. If you haven't seen it yet, I invite you to put the interview on your watch later list, because the ambassador's analysis of the state of affairs is distinctly different from what is currently pushed through the ever more obedient mainstream media in most Western countries. And the same is true for the conflict we are discussing today, the war in Ukraine. So if you want to get an insider's view on this drama from a man who has been at the very center of US foreign power throughout most of his life, then join us for the next 90 minutes or so, where we are discussing anything between the Nord Stream attacks and the unprovoked invasion of Ukraine. Ambassador Freeman, thank you so much for talking to me again. It's the second time in not too long a period. How are you today?
I'm well, thank you, and a pleasure to be with you again.
I see the relocation did you well. You're looking splendid. How do you do that?
I am in a new cottage in Exeter, New Hampshire. The last time I believe I was in the family house in Bristol, Rhode Island. I've not had time to clutter up this office, so it's still pretty spare.
Okay, I understand. But really, really good to see you again. Good to see you in well health. And I know already that your mind is as sharp and as brilliant as it always has been.
You're too kind.
So, starting, I just asked you, did you see the Tucker Carlson interview with Putin just before we started recording? And you said yes. So I would like to have your, let's say, three key takeaways from that interview. Of course, we both know that the interview is criticized in the US, and we can talk about the reasons. Yeah. We also know, I mean, me personally, I'm not a fan of Tucker Carlson. Yeah. But besides that, speaking with politicians should not be negated or suppressed in principle. Yeah. So what are your key takeaways from that interview?
Well, the first and most important thing about it was that it took place. It broke a barrier, a sound barrier, if you will, between the Russians and the West. We in the West have not had a chance to hear Mr. Putin directly. We hear our own propaganda. We don't hear his. And I think it's terribly important that Tucker Carlson did have this interview. He's not my favorite journalist either. But I must say, he has a good habit of listening rather than pursuing his own agenda. So he's criticized in part for not repeating the Western narrative about Mr. Putin's demonic character and terrible, evil misdeeds. What he did was invite Mr. Putin to state his case. And I think Mr. Putin did so effectively. I don't think it makes good television to speak at length about the tangled history of your country as he did at the outset. But arguably, that was useful in that it reminded people who have no idea of this complex history that it is complex. And whether you agree with Mr. Putin's interpretation of Russian history or not, it's clear that he has an encyclopedic command of it. It's clear that he's a rational thinker. It's clear that he's a strategic reasoner. And I thought the most interesting parts of this were when he harked back to Boris Yeltsin and his own effort to join a pan-European security system headed by NATO. He raised this question, he said, with Bill Clinton. Clinton thought this was interesting and possible, but then was talked out of it by his neoconservative advisors, and in the evening told Mr. Putin, no, it was not possible. I thought this was very interesting because we now have to focus on the situation in Europe after Ukraine. Ukraine is not going to go on forever, as some hope. There aren't enough Ukrainians to do that. And I note that the Russian offensive has just succeeded at Avdiivka, which is the key to the control of Lugansk and Donetsk, the two originally independent so-called People's Republics, Russian-speaking areas in eastern Ukraine. So we're coming to a crunch point, and the questions now are, will Mr. Putin move the goalposts? He's been very consistent up to this point about his objectives. Will he now expand those objectives to reflect what he can do on the battlefield? Will he, for example, go for Odessa, a traditionally Russian city in the southern part of Ukraine, and deprive Ukraine of its Black Sea coast? Or will he respond to a request for negotiation? Yeah. He said he would. We don't know. But beyond that, I don't see how the Ukraine issue can be dealt with except in the broader context of the discussion of European security architecture that he began in December in 2021. He demanded this, and when he was rebuffed, he used force.
And we're gonna come to all of this in detail. Yeah? But if I may one more time try, what are your key takeaways from the interview itself?
Well, I think I've stated my main conclusions. Mr. Putin continues to be willing to negotiate, he says. The immediate response from the White House and Mr. Stoltenberg was, for NATO, was, no way we're going to negotiate with you. If you don't negotiate, the only alternative is a continuation of the fighting, and that is not going well for the West. So I think Mr. Putin, what he said was factually mostly correct, had a basis, and the statement that, everything he said was lies just suggests to me that nobody listened to the interview. But in fact, 1 billion people have now heard that interview, which is probably a record. So I go back to the main significance of it is that it has broken the barrier against Russian statement of its position. Yeah. And the world now knows what that is.
And I would like to underline one point that you just said, and you said it en passant, but I think it's a very important one. You say, with your experience and with your background, you say that in general, the facts that Putin discussed were correct.
Yes, that is correct. And I suppose that will surprise many people, because one of the techniques that has been applied in this information war that has been conducted by the West, along with the war in Ukraine, has been to attribute to Mr. Putin and to Russia all sorts of objectives which it has never adopted and never announced. So we are told the purpose of this exercise in Ukraine is to pave the way for a general invasion of Europe. But at the same time, of course, it's apparent that Mr. Putin has used force in a measured manner. He has not applied every bit of force Russia is capable of, suggesting that the war, like the name he gave to it, special military operation, is a limited exercise. And there's no evidence, given 2 years of warfare, in which he has been able to take 17, 18% of Ukraine's territory only, that he has the capability, or Russia has the capability or the ambition to go further. But as someone once quipped, NATO now exists to solve the problem that NATO's existence produces. And we see alarmist talk escalating as the war goes badly in Ukraine. Why? It is a mobilization technique. It is intended to buttress support for defense spending and so on. And I actually believe that Europe does need to pay more attention to defense and to stop relying entirely on the United States. And that this question, which has not really been much discussed, is now becoming ripe as the war in Ukraine proceeds.
Yeah. And we will talk about Europe in a moment. I have a couple of points in regards to it. And as a perfect segue, we have the Nord Stream attacks. So before I ask you some specific questions, could you elaborate? What's your vision on the Nord Stream attack?
Well, I have great confidence in Cy Hirsch's reporting. He has a record of dissident reporting that has turned out to be correct on many, many issues. And he has always been opposed and denigrated by the mainstream media. And I believe he is correct that this was done by the United States, he says, in partnership with Norway. In any event, whoever did this successfully produced a progressive deindustrialization of Germany and an energy crisis in Europe that is weakening Europe. This is the opposite of the stated purpose of the war in Ukraine, which is to weaken Russia. Russia has not been weakened, Europe has been. So whoever did this made a terrible mistake. This is backfired.
It's backfired, and Noam Chomsky, Jeffrey Sachs, CIA analyst Roy McGovern, which I interviewed, I think, at least a year ago, stated then already that in their perspective, it's clear that America is behind those attacks, right?
Well, there is of course the principle of cui bono, who benefits, and the benefits are very clearly not just strategic alignment of Europe with the United States, but also an enormous increase in natural gas exports by the United States at very high prices to Europe, and the removal of European competition, industrial competition from key areas, as Europe can no longer produce economically. So all of this is very supportive of the suspicion that the United States was behind the Nord Stream 2 blow up.
I made a whole video about this, inclusive all the statements from the Biden, also from consecutive U.S. administrations, Blinken, Nuland, etc., what they said they would do with Nord Stream. So there's enough. There are enough indications as to who is really behind this, whose interests are behind that. Yeah. But what I would like to discuss with you is what is underestimated, I believe, and you scratched it on already, are the actual consequences, the long-term, the short-term and long-term consequences for not only the Germany, yeah, but for Europe. And you use the word deindustrialization, and you're not the only one in my interviews who uses exactly that word. Can you elaborate? Because I mean, over and beyond the obvious, yeah, people, and I'm here in the Netherlands, I can tell you people are not very well informed, if they're informed at all about this attack, and they're absolutely oblivious about the consequences. I would even go so far to say that part of the reasons for the farmers' protests that you have basically now spreading across Europe can be traced back to this Nord Stream attack. So under that umbrella, long-term, short-term consequences, your view?
Well, the principal immediate consequence, of course, has been on petrochemical-based industries, which include fertilizer, which is part of the agricultural issue that you mentioned. Germany was a great leader in this field, and it is now exporting its industries because they cannot be maintained economically at current energy prices in Germany. I'd say one of the weirder aspects of all of this is the role of the Green Party, which, basically shut down nuclear power, and then has advocated the return of coal as a response to the energy crisis that the absence of natural gas at reasonable prices has produced. And it's the Green Party, which seems to be more viscerally anti-Russian than anyone else. So we have a strange combination of factors affecting Europe. One is a populist reaction to immigration. You have this in your own country. And this is connected with a sort of fascist tendency on the part of European politicians, quite similar to Mr. Trump in the United States. And we see this combined with other factors leading to the alienation of youth. I don't know in the Netherlands what is the situation, but in the United States, young people are very disillusioned with the attitudes of the elderly elite. We're going into an election with two old men, one of whom is an inveterate liar and poorly informed about everything, and the other who seems to be in a state of senility and has been the author of numerous wars in his tenure. This is something that is greatly objected to by young people. And we see this with the realignment of politics in the United States. The independents, that is, those who belong to neither of the established parties, are the fastest growing bloc of voters. And this is a disillusionment. And I think if there is a sickness in the West, it is this alienation of the elite from the mass. And the mass, of course, there are elderly voters. I should know I'm one, but many are apathetic. They continue to promote whatever ideas they traditionally did, and they don't recognize that the world has changed and requires different responses to different issues.
Yeah. So here in Holland, we had just a right-wing government elected. Yeah, Geert Wilders. It was, I think, 2 months ago or so. I mean, the cabinet is still in formation. Yeah, but this is a trend that you see. I would say global. Yeah, in multiple countries. Yeah, this return to populism, right?
Well, it's ubiquitous in the West, and it's not limited to the West because we see it in India as well, and I think we see it in Israel very clearly with the very fascist tendency that has taken over the government there.
So it's very tempting to jump into Israel, yeah, but I try to avoid it because we discussed it last time, and I should have said it. And I thought I did, but I didn't. Yeah. So the interview, the first interview with you, yeah, and we produced shorts from this interview about Israel. Some of the shorts have been on some partner channels, yeah, 100,000 views, and the most viewed clip was viewed more than 2 million times. So Ambassador Freeman, I think it's fair to say you went viral, yeah. But again, that was on the topic of Israel, and since we had such an engaging conversation about Israel in that interview, you kindly agreed to the second interview, which we're having now on the topic of mainly Russia, Ukraine, yeah. So coming back to that, we had the Brexit, yeah, and now I heard you talking about the Dexit. So in general terms, do you really think there's a chance that Europe falls apart again, and what would that mean?
I certainly hope not. One of the positive elements of what is happening is this is the silver in the black cloud, I suppose. One of the things that is happening is Europeans have become aware of the perils of relying exclusively on the United States. They fear the election of Mr. Trump, who has just announced that he will not honor Article 5 of the NATO treaty unless Europeans pay. This, from my point of view, as an American, I find this enormously insulting. It reduces us to the level of mercenaries. Either we are helping to defend Europe because it's in our interest to do so, or we're doing it, as Mr. Trump suggests, as a sort of business proposition. I trust that it does reflect our interests. But Europeans have been reminded that you have to do more in your own defense. And I have said elsewhere, and I will repeat this, that I think in the United States, there are two kinds of people who feel a resonance with Mr. Trump's statements. One are simple populists who don't know much, but really ask, quite reasonably, why 75 years after the revival of Europe, many wealthy, powerful societies joined together in a new structure in Europe, why is the United States still being required to pay for the defense of Europe? Why? And isn't there a better approach? Shouldn't Europeans do more? That's one thought. The other is strategic reasoners, strategic thinkers, who say, look, it would be far better for the United States and for Europe if Europe took a greater role in its own defense. Why should Americans be on the front line? We should be backup. That was our historic role in World War I and World War II. Why are we still fighting the Cold War when there is no more messianic ideological impulse from Moscow, and there are no satellites, and there is no indication that Mr. Putin has any desire to do anything but remove American forces from his borders, neutralize Ukraine, achieve a Ukrainian government that is not overtly hostile to Russia and does not pose the sort of menace to Russia that long-range Ukrainian strikes now demonstrate is a reality. That is probably thanks to Victoria Nuland, whom you mentioned. Anyway, and beyond that, as I said earlier, part of the process by which Europeans re-establish control over European destiny is a discussion of European security architecture. And we need to find an architecture which does not threaten either Western Europe or Russia, and which reduces the role of the United States to one of a balancer, not a frontline combatant, which is the current posture. So I think there are a lot of questions that are gelling. We are not seeing much discussion of them, but I'm fairly confident we will.
If you allow me for a moment to play devil's advocate, yeah, I'm a European, so I'm looking at this from the inside and from the outside at the same time, from inside of Europe, of course, and when it comes to America from the outside, yeah. But playing devil's advocate, yeah. So I heard somewhere, in the past, America has played the role of the global policeman, right? My argument would be a different one. America has never played the global policeman. America has always ensured its own interests. And the best way of demonstrating is, of course, the 900 or so military bases around the world. 750 we have confirmed, another 150 or so black sites, right? In Germany, we have somewhere between 30, 40,000 soldiers still. Yeah, you could almost see this as a kind of occupation, right? So America has, from the Second World War on, immediately striven to protect its own hegemonic interests. And one more thing, America, I think, had a very unique chance. America was, for a number of years, let's say, we can debate about the exact, between 20 and 30 years, a unipolar moment as being the strongest and only superpower in the world. And if we now look back, or we don't need to look back, we are just looking at the situation right now. Was that not a massive lost opportunity, lost chance. And why, I mean, tempting, yeah? But why was America not able to exploit, in a good sense, in a benevolent sense, yeah, this unipolar moment better for the good of everybody, not only America?
Well, I think that was a failure of imagination and leadership. I agree with you that the United States, in most respects, has policed its own interests rather than common interests. And we are now advocating something called the rules-based order, as opposed to the law-based order, which is what we advocated during the Cold War, even if we didn't entirely respect the principle of law. You don't hear anything about law, the United Nations, collective decision-making, consultation from American politicians anymore. And the President of the United States goes annually to the General Assembly meeting in New York. And whereas in the past, I think there was great interest in whatever new ideas we've not had a female president yet, put forward, because the United States was regarded as the global leader. Now I think there's not much interest and a great deal of opposition to the very self-interested sort of statements that American presidents now make. From an American point of view, let me make a few comments about NATO, Europe, and so forth. From our point of view, we don't want, it is risky to leave Europe to its own devices. Twice in the 20th century, arguably 3 times. Europe unbalanced itself, and we had to cross the Atlantic to rebalance it. That was the case in World War I. It was the case in World War II, which we tried to stay out of, some would argue irresponsibly. We sat and did nothing for 2 years while your own country was under occupation and Britain was burning. And it was only Hitler's foolish decision to join the Japanese in declaring war on the United States that brought us into that war in Europe. During the Cold War, which we had something to do with starting, as you suggested, similarly, we found ourselves entangled in European affairs. We actually did a pretty good job, in my estimation. We had wise leaders who promoted what has become the EU, the European Union, tried to produce a partner in Europe for us, an equal partner at the beginning. And if that has failed, I don't think we can be blamed for it. But let me make a number of comments about NATO. If the United States must keep a hand in Europe in our own interest in order to prevent catastrophes from drawing us across the Atlantic again, then NATO is the appropriate vehicle. And NATO has many merits. Among other things, it submerges a very large, powerful Germany in a broader constellation of states, which means that concerns about German power are diluted. It also provides a balance between Western Europe and Russia. Now, I would argue that that balance could be more effectively managed by a greater European role. And in fact, I hope that one of the things that comes out of the failure in Ukraine will be a discussion of European security architecture and the Europeanization of NATO, meaning putting NATO under a European commander and with the Americans backing NATO, remaining in it, but not attempting to make decisions for Europeans about European security, advising, perhaps consulting, because in the end we will be called upon if Europe makes mistakes, but not attempting to exercise a hegemonic role. So I think a final point about NATO. One of the things that I discovered when I was ambassador to Saudi Arabia during the Gulf War in 1990-91 was that NATO has created the only operational doctrines, software, if you will, that allow a true multinational coalition force to operate on the battlefield. NATO has 3,000 standardization agreements. These allow a Dutch soldier to cooperate with a Greek, even though they have no language in common, to do various things. And these could be peacekeeping, they could be disaster relief, or they could be war. But this is unique. The Warsaw Pact never did this. The Eastern Europeans were mere auxiliaries to the Russian army, and I had a fantastic experience at Garmisch when I was trying to persuade Eastern Europeans to understand and join the Partnership for Peace, which I had something to do with formulating. And I will tell you, the Czech chief of staff came to Garmisch, and he spoke perfect German. My German is not good. And we had quite a good discussion, I think mostly in French. And after dinner, the day of our discussions, he said to me, "Would you like to take a walk in the town?" And I said, "That sounds great." And so we went up the streets of Garmisch, and he said, "This is Heidi's dress shop, and her husband Hans over there has a butcher shop, and this and that and so forth." And I said, "How do you know all this? You must be frequently here." And he said, "I have never been here in my life before, but I was trained to occupy this place." And I thought, yes, whatever doubts I had about the role of the Soviet army and the Warsaw Pact are immediately erased. The Hungarian turned up and he spoke perfect Italian, having been trained to occupy northern Italy. The Slovak turned up and he also had German. But anyway, I then went to Ukraine after the fall of the Soviet Union, of course, and I talked to the National Security Advisor, and I asked him what his major problems were. And he said, well, there are two. One, we're deployed on the wrong border. We are deployed against the West, but if we shift our forces to the East, this will alarm the Russians and we will have a war. And number two, I had asked him, I said, what was your most exciting experience in your life? He said, when I went to Copenhagen, I had spent 17 years practicing parachute drops on Copenhagen. I knew it like the back of my hand, but I had never been there. He said, it was wonderful. I love that place. Anyway, he said, we were trained for offense. We did no training for defense, none. We were going to attack. And he said, now we have to learn how to defend Ukraine. And I thought, this is all very interesting, but it's irrelevant now. We're not dealing with the Soviet Union. We are not dealing with a Russian army that is poised to come through the Fulda Gap and take over Western Europe. Whether they wanted to do that or they saw that as a necessary defense of the Russian heartland or not is beside the point. They clearly made the plans to do that and tried to develop the capability. They don't have that capability. They have learned a huge amount on the battlefields of Ukraine. They have learned how to counter virtually every NATO weapon system of importance. They have adopted new technology based on drones. They have become accustomed to a battlefield where everything is visible. The fog of war has been lifted. You can now see the enemy exactly as it moves around. That is why tanks are now coffins, not platforms for attacking things. Now, maybe this will shift again in the future, but at the moment, it's very clear that Ukraine and the Ukrainians have been quite ingenious, and the Russians have been equally ingenious, and they have come up with a new pattern of warfare that NATO is not prepared for. And so I would say when this is over, which it will be, because it will end in a negotiated settlement of some sort. And that settlement, it's pretty clear now, is going to be on Russian terms because Ukraine has lost bargaining power and so has NATO. And people have conferences in Kyiv talking about retaking Crimea and regaining the Donbass This is delusional, and it is inspired not by a desire to protect Ukraine or Ukrainians, but by a desire to inflict pain on Russia. That is not a viable policy for Europeans or for the United States in the long run. And so I hope that we will have a discussion, not just of European security architecture, but also a review of this war in terms of what it should have taught us about how to conduct or how not to conduct a war. Finally, I hope we will rediscover diplomacy, because this entire exercise has been free of any diplomacy. Bombing is not diplomacy, even if you describe it as sending a message to the other side. It is not doing dialogue, and without dialogue, you cannot reach an understanding. And usually when you bomb people, they are not pacified, they are enraged. And usually when you when you ban Tchaikovsky and you ban Dostoevsky and you attack the Russian pride in Russian culture, you unify Russians against you. And that is what we have done. So from every point of view, the Ukraine issue has been a disaster. For the Ukrainians, it's been a catastrophe. For strategic global strategy, it has pushed Russia and China into an embrace that never would have happened without it. That is a mistake. It has deindustrialized Europe in part, a process that is ongoing. It has led to healthy hedging by Europeans against American abandonment, but not to a serious discussion of a post-Ukraine Europe. And that needs to come. And I think Mr. Trump, the problem with Mr. Trump is that he appears to understand that things have changed and Europe must pull its own weight and be primarily responsible for its own defense. But he has no concept of diplomacy, consultation, dialogue, or a process by which to adjust transatlantic relations in a smooth and mutually beneficial manner. So what he's likely to do is something abrupt and destabilizing. And Europeans are right to be concerned about that.
Again, coming back to playing devil's advocate, my argument would be that when Trump or any administration says Europe has to prepare itself better to defend itself, they're partly true. But the question is, defend against what? Defend against problems caused by the US, not against problems caused by Europe, right? Again, coming back to hegemony. But very briefly, in regards to the Tucker Carlson interview, the thing, and you scratched on it, that I took away was the fact that Putin said he can't remember when he spoke last to Biden. That comes back to you saying there is no diplomacy at the moment. Now, how absolutely dangerous is that in a war scenario where the leaders of the opponent parties are not talking to each other? I'm almost tempted to say that I could forgive Putin not to talk to Biden because he looks like he has dementia. I mean, on some of those interviews, he's so far off, he seriously looks like he has dementia. And he wouldn't be the only one, because we know that Reagan had Alzheimer, right? But the powers behind the president who cling to power with everything they have, those are the ones that someone would have to talk to from the Russian side. Yeah.
Well, you've raised multiple issues. I think we have made the same mistake we made after World War I, when instead of integrating Germany and Russia into a Council of Europe, a management system for European security, we excluded them. In the case of the Bolsheviks, they were happy to be excluded. But this was a terrible mistake, and it led directly to World War II. And I think we made the same mistake. We have to maintain dialogue and contact. And I don't think Europe can enjoy peace without an organic relationship with this great country to the east, Russia, which is partly European, partly not. One has one foot in Europe and one outside. And it has played an important role in European balance over certainly in the 19th century. I mean, we have the word bistrot in French from the Russian quick, meaning a fast food place demanded by the Russian soldiers when they occupied Paris after the Napoleonic Wars. So I think you've raised a lot of issues, but certainly dialogue is essential. Let me say something about European security issues, because they're not all caused by the United States. Some of them are the product of, yes, American foolish behavior, the destabilization of Syria, which we were not alone in, which has produced a huge flow of refugees, the Afghan misadventure, which was NATO, not just the US, various elements of nuclear.
Sorry, just for me to understand. Yeah, so Syria and Afghanistan, yes, the Europeans participated, right? But the initiator clearly was the US, right?
The initiator, in the case of Israel, of Syria, was Israel, but the French were involved from the very beginning.
But the Israelis did it because they could do so under the umbrella of the Americans.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not. I do accept primary responsibility for that. There's also the Libyan adventure, which I don't think we were primarily responsible for, although we ended up in the lead. Some European countries had opted out of that, and that was NATO à la carte. And that was the beginning of a trans-Mediterranean migration problem that is bedeviling Europe, and we talked about it earlier. It's creating populist animosity to immigration and leading to a kind of rebirth of fascism in Europe. But these are problems, and I would add, we had an issue with the breakup of Yugoslavia. And I would argue that the proximate cause of the disaster that ensued was the German recognition of Croatia prematurely. This was a European problem, which the Americans tried very hard to stay out of for quite a long time. Europe did not step forward, and in the end, NATO, quite illegally under international law, conducted an intervention, which provided, I think, the inspiration for the Russian seizure of Crimea, ultimately. Anyway, it's clear that we would have all been better off if NATO had, as conceived under the Partnership for Peace, emerged as a cooperative security instrument, one in which Russia was included to some degree, or perhaps entirely, and which was charged with the management of security issues in Europe on a cooperative basis. That could have dealt with Yugoslavia in a very different manner, and it would have had very different results, I think, in Ukraine. One of the concepts of the Partnership for Peace was that Ukraine would want to join it to become militarily interoperable with the West, but not to join NATO, because to join NATO would be an intolerable provocation to Moscow, something which most people, except for the neoconservatives in the United States, appeared to understand. So, yes, this is a great tangled mess. We need to untangle it. We need to clean it up. And we need to recognize that we are dealing now with different security issues. We don't want German nuclear weapons, but Germans are beginning to talk about this. And, that is the wrong way for Europe to go, I think. But how do we prevent that? I don't think just making statements that it's not a good idea is going to change history very much. There needs to be a process. Where is the process? Who are the leaders who will take us into it? Olaf Scholz clearly doesn't have any clue, and Macron doesn't appear to have any idea either. And you've got Meloni in Italy, whose regime is somewhat strange. And you have Geert Wilders in Holland. So who is going to lead this? We have Biden and Trump, the problems with which we're all familiar. And the preference of American voters going into the fall appears to be none of the above, neither of them. But there is no alternative. Kamala Harris says she's prepared to serve, but I don't think anybody wants her to. And so there is a leadership vacuum in Europe, in the United States, and it's illustrated. I think I don't want to get back into the Israel-Palestine mess, but it's illustrated by the hypocritical statements and lack of action that we see on the genocide in Gaza and the pogroms in the West Bank. And it's illustrated also in the failure to talk to the Russians. What is the harm of talking to people? You don't have to agree with them. You can talk and explain to them why you don't agree with them. You can try to understand their point of view and see if there's a basis for some common interest to prevail.
Ambassador, if we now really focus on Ukraine, right? The one word, again, parallels to Israel in the first couple of days after, or weeks even, after October 7th, we heard by every interview was starting, do you condemn Hamas, right? In the case of Ukraine, it was the unprovoked invasion of Ukraine. So what?
Which is nonsense. Nonsense. It was entirely provoked. Boris Yeltsin, the predecessor to Vladimir Putin, as early as 1994, registered strong objections to the eastward expansion of NATO, which he had been assured would not occur. There were 5 expansions. Each one brought Western troops, American troops, and bases and facilities closer to the Russian border. Russia tolerated the incorporation of the Baltics, which are not much of a threat to anyone, into NATO. But it made it very clear, starting in 2007 at the Munich Security Conference, when Mr. Putin spoke and made it clear that he was not prepared to accept the further expansion of NATO. That was answered in 2008 with an invitation to both Georgia and Ukraine. Russia reacted by demonstrating that it was serious by having a war with Georgia, that it was not prepared to tolerate this indefinite expansion of the American sphere of influence to its border. It did not attempt to reincorporate Ukraine into the Russian sphere of influence. It attempted to exclude it from the American sphere of influence. It demanded neutrality along the lines of the Austrian State Treaty of 1955 in Ukraine. The answer from the West, the United States and NATO, was, we won't talk to you about that. We are determined. NATO has an open door. Well, we don't apply the same principle to Mexico. If it wanted to join the Warsaw Pact, I think we would have a view about that. Certainly we did when Cuba aligned itself with the Soviet Union. That caused a great crisis. So there is a saying in English, what's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. And you can't have a principle which is applied selectively. Either it applies to everyone or it applies to no one. And so here we are. In December of 2021, Mr. Putin massed troops on the Ukrainian border. We said he intended to invade. And our response was, we reject any negotiation with you. We won't even talk with you. So what we might talk about is the offensive capabilities of our anti-ballistic missile system in Poland and Romania. And that's it. So he did what would be expected, what we did expect. Namely, he used force since he was denied a negotiation. No surprise, not unprovoked. Constant warnings from 1994 on. And that is a long time.
Could it be, I mean, just thinking out loud, could it be that it was a kind of a trap? And I remember when, before Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, right? He was ensured from America, this is an inter-Arab situation and America would not intervene, right? We know this for a fact. Could it be a similar scenario here? Because it's clear it was no surprise for the American administration that Putin would invade. I mean, William Burns even wrote it in his memoirs. He said, William Burns, former ambassador to Russia and now CIA director, he wrote, the joining of Ukraine and Georgia to NATO is the reddest of red line for Putin and his elite. It's not only Putin. Yeah. So could it have been a trap for?
I don't think so. I was involved in the war to liberate Kuwait and tried very hard with April Glaspie, who was our ambassador in Baghdad, to get instructions about the threats that Saddam Hussein was making to Kuwait. She had no instructions. Ambassadors who don't have instructions cannot threaten war. So she said, I have no instructions on this. This is something to be worked out among Arabs, clearly, since the United States was not taking a position. And in fact, at the time, we were inadvertently sending every signal of disinterest in the security of the Persian Gulf. We were trying to withdraw the Commandant's force, which we'd had there since 1947. We were proposing to close the American Consulate General in Dhahran, which was an important outpost during the Cold War and right in the center of the oil fields. Those are not important anymore. We were doing a variety of things. We had terrible relations with Kuwait. We were not, on the eve of the invasion, the American ambassador to Kuwait called the prime minister, the emir, and asked, "Is there something you want us to do?" And he said, "Oh no, it's all under control." But they were having talks in Jeddah, which turned out to be a deception by Saddam Hussein. So I would say that that is not an instance of a trap. It's an instance of bungling and strategic blindness and self-centered. Lots of things were happening in the world. Germany was reuniting. The Soviet Union was collapsing. Soviet Empire was disappearing. Many things were happening. And the attention of Washington was limited to those things, and they weren't paying attention. And I think the same thing, strategic bungling, amateur hour on the part of political leaders in Washington, and of course the legacy of the unipolar moment that you mentioned, which we believed made us omniscient, omnipotent, invulnerable, and so forth. It was not until 9/11 that we learned that that was not true. So I think there was nothing's going to happen because we're so powerful. Saddam Hussein wouldn't dare do anything. And there was no understanding that Iraq's territorial and other ambitions in the Gulf had been limited by its client state relationship with Moscow. But Moscow was no longer in a position to restrain Baghdad. And that too had disappeared with the end of the Cold War. And some of us in the Gulf understood that, but we could not persuade Washington that was the case. So I think, yes, Bill Burns, as ambassador to Moscow, as head of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, in his memoir, before he became head of the CIA, was very clear-minded about this. As head of the CIA, it is not his business to make policy, although that distinction is often violated, I believe. I have not heard him dissent from the president's view, even though the president's view must be regarded by him as seriously misguided, given his previous understanding of this issue. So we have the further issue of a lack of tradition of high-level resignations in protest of policies. The last time this happened really was Secretary of State Vance resigning over the Iran hostage issue. So many factors went into this, but it wasn't a trap. It was, and this brings me to a fundamental adage of statecraft, and that is very important. Never attribute to malice what can be explained by stupidity, because there are far more stupid people in the world than there are evil people.
I'm gonna remember that one. Yeah. If you now focus on 2014 in Kiev, yeah, I have interviewed Ivan Kachanovsky, who wrote a PhD on what actually happened here. He has massive data, inclusive transmission transcripts, reporters on the ground, cell phone information, all kinds of stuff. Yeah. So for him, it's clear an outside power instigated a coup. Yeah, and I mean we can speculate who is the outside power, but we had again Victoria Nuland there, John McCain handing out cookies and bread. It's about like if Russian representatives would have been at January 6th insurrection, right, supporting
Yeah,
the attackers of the capital there. Yeah? So in your point of
a
view,
good
what happened really in 2014 in Kiev?
Oh, that was a color revolution contrived as part of a regime change process by the United States. No question about it. And the reactions to it on the part of the Russians were entirely predictable. They included the incorporation of Crimea, which, by the way, was supported by the Crimeans for the most part. There had been two previous referenda in the Crimea, in which the Crimea made it clear it did not want to be part of Ukraine. It wanted to be part of Russia or independent. Actually, the first referendum produced a demand for independence. Both those reflections of popular sentiment were overturned and controlled and reversed by Ukrainian nationalists from Western Ukraine. So, yes, I mean, there's no doubt what happened and the consequences of it. Among the consequences was the opening of a Ukrainian civil war between Russian speakers in the East and Ukrainian ultranationalists in the West. So that civil war went on for 8 years before the 2022 invasion of Ukraine by Russia. And it quickly became a proxy war between the US and Russia, NATO and Russia, with the United States and NATO training the Ukrainian army, which expanded hugely. On the eve of the war, when Ukraine was preparing an offensive against the Donbass Russian-speaking areas, part of the reason for the Russian massing of troops on the border was to counter this impending invasion of that region. On the eve of the war, Ukraine had the largest army in Europe other than Turkey. And, it was almost as large as the entire Russian army. And the Russian army was not trained to the level that the Ukrainian army was. For 8 years, we had trained the Ukrainians to NATO standards. Including, by the way, the very same ultranationalists that our press was accurately describing as neo-Nazi until they suddenly became patriotic heroes in the war with Russia. We're talking about a country that has adopted Stepan Bandera as its founding father, someone who was associated with the German SS and whose forces apparently killed 150,000 Poles and 250,000 Jews in Galicia, which is now part of Ukraine. Anyway, because the Soviet Union shifted the borders after World War II. Anyway, this is a very complex story, and it has been erased by propaganda and a narrative that is very powerful. And we have successfully demonized both Mr. Putin and Russia to the extent that people can do what we did after the Tucker Carlson interview, saying, well, he says he wants to negotiate. We don't want to negotiate with him. This is a repetition of Boris Johnson's intervention in April of 2022, when Ukraine and Russia had reached an agreement, in principle at least, a draft treaty by which Ukraine would declare neutrality, would accept security guarantees from other European countries, maybe the United States. Russia would withdraw from Ukraine. The Donbass region would be back under the Minsk Accords as an integral federalized part of Ukraine. All of this was agreed. Boris Johnson went to Kyiv and said to Mr. Zelensky, you may want to have peace, but we want to fight. Our objective is to weaken and isolate Russia, and we will back you if you do that. So please don't sign that treaty. Please don't meet with Mr. Putin, with whom there was a meeting being arranged. And the result was no peace and all war, and that here we are. So the tangled story of how this war began does not substantiate the assertion that it was unprovoked or that we were somehow innocent of any interference in regime change in Ukraine.
If we stay for a moment in 2014, yeah, let's talk about the Minsk agreements. And I'm using what you said about Boris Johnson as a segue for you as a diplomat. Yeah, so we know that both the former German Chancellor Angela Merkel and the French President Hollande, I believe, said that the Minsk agreements were nothing but a strategy to buy time to arm and train Ukraine, right? Combined with what you just told us about Boris Johnson, right? How trustworthy is Western Europe's and America's diplomacy in the eyes of the rest of the world? I'm specifically saying the rest of the world and not only restricting this to Russia.
Well, I think we have acquired a very bad record. Now, I don't know whether Mrs. Merkel and President Hollande were making a convenient statement that, you see, we weren't really serious about this. We really were against Russia all along, which was a politically convenient statement. Maybe they were sincere. Maybe they really were insincere in pursuing they were sincere about their insincerity in pursuing the Minsk Accords. Perhaps they were. Maybe not. I don't know. But in fact, the way the Minsk Accords were used was precisely to arm Ukraine against Russia and to create a menace to Russia that did not exist. So let me say, I don't want to keep coming back to the Israel-Palestine issue, but the peace process, so-called, turns out to have been the biggest diplomatic fraud in history. There was no real effort to make peace. There was an effort to cover up and provide political cover for Israeli expansion and annexation of Palestinian land and for settlement of that land by immigrants from here, there, and everywhere, subsidized by the Israeli state, which in turn is subsidized by the United States. So that is a lesson to the world about American diplomacy. We have an instance in China where we reached an agreement between 1972 and 1979 on how to manage the Taiwan question. We have abandoned all three of the agreements that we made. We now have a transparently official relationship with Taiwan, although we call it unofficial, which fools no one. We promised not to have any troops or installations on the island, but they're back. We said we would not have a defense commitment to Taiwan. We ended the treaty that provided such a commitment. And yet we have a president who on 4 occasions has asserted that, of course, we'll defend Taiwan. And we're behaving as though we intend to do that. So there, too, we have broken our word. We have developed a habit of abrogating or terminating treaties at will. Pacta sunt servanda was the legal principle we all followed in an earlier age. That is, treaties or agreements must be honored. We don't do that anymore. If it's inconvenient, we end it. This is very cynical. I remember Charles de Gaulle saying once that treaties are like young women or flowers. They last while they last. They're ephemeral. They're not eternal. I thought at the time when he said that, this was a very solid instance of traditional French cynicism. But I'm sorry to say we have adopted that principle ourselves. So do we have a good reputation? Would anyone trust an agreement with us? Well, there are gullible people out there, no doubt, but I wouldn't count on it.
Yeah. And if we now switch from, let's say, diplomatic behavior to economic behavior, and let's talk about the 300 billion US dollars that America threatens. Also, these are Russian assets, and America threatens to confiscate them in order to build up Ukraine or whatever they're planning, right? So, what are they? I mean, over and beyond the Russian and Ukrainian situation, but on a global stage, what does that mean for the US dollar?
Well, it's potentially catastrophic. The Islamic Republic of Iran has a policy-making body called the Expediency Council, which makes expedient, unprincipled decisions. This is an expedient, unprincipled decision. The basic responsibility of any banker or central banker is to protect the deposits of the depositor. This is something actually the Dutch had something to do with inventing as a concept. And it is, if you go around confiscating the deposits that have been entrusted to you, violating your fiduciary duty, you will become nobody's banker. So if we do this, I think the consequence will be a collapse in the US dollar's role as a reserve currency. It seems to me that European central bankers understand this because they seem to be groping for a way to use the interest on the Russian reserves rather than the capital itself to do nice things for Ukraine. But this too is irresponsible, and it will do nothing for the reputation of the international financial system. So I don't think, I'm all for making decisions that serve national interests, but if they are unprincipled and purely expedient, you should expect consequences. And there will be severe consequences if we actually do this, which is why in the end I don't believe we will.
The BRICS countries are growing in number. Yeah, Saudi Arabia has joined BRICS now in January, right? And one of the objectives of BRICS is, of course, to supplant or substitute the US dollar as world reserve currency. Now, we know that a number of countries already started selling oil or natural resources, oil, gas, whatever, against something else, the US dollar, right? Now, both coincidentally, coincidence or not, both Saddam Hussein and Libya's Gaddafi did the same thing, and they paid with their life for it, right? So the petrodollar is the lifeblood of America, right? Without petrodollar, no super carriers. Yeah. So in your perspective, how threatening is BRICS, or could BRICS become to the US dollar or the petrodollar?
Well, this is a different question than the dollar as a
World reserve.
reservoir of value, a reserve currency. That is jeopardized by the proposal to seize the assets of Russia, as indeed we have done with Venezuela and earlier with Iran. Pretty bad track record for
And
a banker.
Afghanistan. And Afghanistan.
As well, yes. Thank you for mentioning that. This is one of the reasons that the BRICS and others have been trying to find ways to evade the dollar. The use of sovereignty over the dollar by the United States to impose unilateral sanctions, which under the UN Charter, by the way, are illegal. Anyway, nobody refers to the UN Charter or international law anymore, as I said earlier. But the question you're raising has to do with the dollar, or for that matter, the euro, as an instrument of trade settlement. That is, a means of settling transactions between different currencies. And this is backstopped by something called SWIFT, which is based in Brussels, which is an information clearinghouse that documents transactions in euros and dollars, and from which Russia and Iran have been suspended. So that means for the Russians, for the Iranians, for others who might potentially become perceived enemies of the West, that you may not be able to do trade. Your trade may be redirected or prevented. And this is not acceptable. And this is what is motivating this search for alternative means around the dollar. So what kinds of means are being explored? Principally, it is bilateral direct currency swaps. That is to say, you take the dirham in the UAE and you make it exchangeable with the renminbi in China, for example, or the ruble and the rupee in India have long been interchangeable, and you persist in that or you expand it. That's one thing, bilateral currency swaps. The second is the use of digital currencies, so that you can, for example, you can take a credit card, which is where your accounts are in Chinese yuan or renminbi, and you can use that in Indonesia and pay directly in rupiah without going through the Federal Reserve in New York, but directly through a digital swap. That is advancing rapidly. And the third element is an effort to create artificial currencies or baskets of currencies, which would resemble the SDR that the IMF has created. These are international baskets of currencies, backed by baskets of currencies, which establish a benchmark value for other currencies and replace the dollar in that role. All these efforts are slow. This is not easy. The dollar is very entrenched, but they are advancing because of the problems of credibility that American and European behavior are creating. So this is a serious matter, and we're going to end up, I think, we're not going to end up with a substitute for the dollar in the form of a national currency. It won't be the Chinese yuan, it won't be the Russian ruble, it won't be the Indian rupee, it won't be the euro. It will be, we'll have many fractured currency systems, which will make life a great deal more complicated for corporations doing business across borders. You can see the benefits of a common currency in the establishment of the euro, despite its problems. And of course, one of the worst things that could happen would be for Brexit to be followed by the departure of, let's say, Germany from the Eurozone. And that could happen because the value of the euro is such that Germany can't devalue its way out of deindustrialization. So we've created a perfect storm here. And the fact that the trees haven't yet blown down is not as reassuring as it might be.
Before I come to my last question, I have one little topic that I would like to bring up: China and NATO. So I heard you say that NATO has to go out of area or it will go out of business. Yeah, and if I interpret certain reports correctly, then this is exactly what NATO is doing under the American umbrella to align NATO to fight China. Would that be a fair statement?
That phrase, out of area or out of business, was the war cry of those who wish to preserve NATO in two roles. One, as a collective security organization aimed at enemies beyond Europe, whether they were Russia or whoever. And second, as an auxiliary support for American interventionism. And that was their battle cry. And indeed, it is what has happened. NATO has gone out of area, went out of area in Afghanistan, went out of area in Libya. The United States tried to take it out of area in Iraq and failed. It is the opposite of a focus on European security, which was the raison d'être of NATO in the beginning, and European balance being served in a defensive alliance, not an offensive alliance. NATO became an offensive alliance, which added to the anxieties of the Russians. And now, anyway, to tell you the truth, I mean, NATO has absolutely zero capability to play any role whatsoever in East Asian defense. So you can talk about this all you want. It's basically a political cosmetic, lips on a pig, we say, to make the pig look good. It is political support for American anti-China strategy. But, the fact that the German Navy is once in a while putting in an appearance in East Asia and has an agreement with Japan, ironically, considering World War II, to exchange logistical support, does absolutely nothing to concern China. And so I remember talking to the German ambassador during the Cold War in Beijing, and he said, Ostpolitik rebounds off the Great Wall. There is something to be said for China as a balancer of Russia, Well, we've managed to destroy that by pushing them together. I don't understand why Europe would want to join in doing that. Doesn't seem to me to be in Europe's interest. I also don't understand why, if the United States foolishly decides that we should alienate ourselves and isolate ourselves from the world's largest population of STEM workers, scientists, technologists, engineers, and mathematicians, which is in China. Over 1/4 of the world's STEM workers are there. And the proportion is growing because of the growth of Chinese universities that are graduating people at ever higher levels of quality and in greater numbers. Why should we want to alienate ourselves from such a resource? Science and technology advance by collaboration, as your own business illustrates. And, this is going to retard our innovation more than it does the Chinese. It's basically forcing them to make use of the huge size of their market to develop a domestic supply chain network that is independent of foreign trade. And meanwhile, of course, we are trying to disrupt supply chains around the world. The net result of that is not to destroy them, but to complicate them. So instead of having a direct supply chain from the port of Los Angeles, congested as it is, to, let's say, Qingdao in Shandong province in China, there's now a connection between Qingdao and Acapulco, or another port in Mexico. And we now have a more complex supply chain with more links that can break. This is not wise. And so I think at the moment there's a great deal of concern in the United States that we don't have a shipbuilding industry anymore. Why? Because of protectionism. Starting in the 1920s with something called the Jones Act, we prohibited non-American manufactured ships from going between American ports. This killed the shipbuilding industry and destroyed our merchant marine. And now we are apparently under Mr. Trump going to put a 60% tariff on everything that comes into our country. We should learn from the past. This is what caused the spread of the Great Depression, but before that, it deindustrialized sections of the American economy. It is absolutely worthy of the title that George H.W. Bush bestowed on his competitors, the opposite candidate for president, namely, this is voodoo economics, not real economics. And so there's a lot to be concerned about. But the approach we're taking to China, in my view, is not going to hurt China as much as it hurts us. And I'm not sure why we want to hurt China anyway, because I don't think China is in search of Lebensraum like the Germans or an empire like the Japanese, and it doesn't have a messianic ideology like the Soviet Union or the United States for that matter. And it has natural borders which it is attempting to reestablish. They include the island of Taiwan. They include Tibet and Xinjiang, which historically have been off and on again parts of China. So we have extrapolated, for the benefit of the military-industrial complex and defense spending and the like, an alarmist vision of China as the new incarnation of Nazi Germany, Soviet Union, Imperial Japan, whatever. There's a wonderful map, which I don't have at hand, but which I encourage you to find, which shows the 17 areas of the world that the British did not invade. They're white. The rest of the world is pink. They invaded everywhere else, including Tibet. And I think it's at this point, it's very hard to find places that the United States has not invaded or fought with. You can't make that list for China. They haven't done anything since they had a war with Vietnam in 1979 to convince the Vietnamese that Vietnam should not make common cause with the Soviet Union in containing them, which they succeeded in doing at huge military cost. So, we are patrolling the coast of China. They are not patrolling our coasts, neither in Europe nor in Asia, nor in the Pacific and North America. I think we've become slightly deranged on this subject. I don't know why. We're back to the famous series of books about Fu Manchu, the evil villain, Chinese villain who hides in a cave in Tibet and manages the entire world conspiratorially. This is not so. Anyway, that is the China relationship is part of the general lapse into two theories, that the world is organized around a contest between democracy and autocracy, which is not true. You can't explain very many problems by that. Maybe there are a few. And second, that the world is organized around great power rivalry. But this at the very moment when middle-ranking powers are asserting their independence and breaking out of the bipolar order that the Cold War had created. There's no G2. The US and China don't control the world. Ask the Gulf Arabs. Ask Iran. Ask the BRICS. What sort of world is emerging? It's not a repetition of the Cold War. So, I think this is another manifestation of strategic solipsism, the imagination that you can, imagining that you can you can understand the world by doing things inside your head, rather than looking at things and accepting an objective vision of them. Everything is entirely subjective, and we invent narratives and we conduct information warfare to convince ourselves and others of things that are not true.
And you said something, America does things that's actually hurting America. And the same is true for the European governments that do something vis-a-vis Russia that clearly hurts the European countries. And I think you partially gave the answer already, because the countries no longer are in full control. Their interests over and beyond the countries, like, for example, the military-industrial complex, with their influence, with their lobbying, with their billions of dollars, influence what's happening. Yeah, and in this context, I come to my absolute last question, Ambassador. America in decline. Would it be a realistic and truthful statement, anticipating that you have 30 million people in the US who live on food stamps? You have inflation. You have a gap between the richest, the rich people and the poor people. Let's say the rich 1 to 10%, and the rest of the society. All the indicators of civilization are going down. The life expectancy goes down. Yeah, crime goes up, etc., etc. Education shambling, infrastructure shambling. Yeah, so For you as an American and for you as a person who spent his life defending America, right? Where do you see America and where do you see, by association, the rest of the world go in the next, I don't know, 5, 10, 15 years?
Well, it's dismaying, of course, because, sorry, we were better than this. We had aspirations to be better still. We seem now to be very complacent and not to be responding to the various challenges you mentioned. I think what is happening is the collapse of our constitutional order. And that means the Anglo-American emphasis on due process. That is, the outcome, the legitimacy of outcomes is determined by whether the process that produces the outcome is fair. If it's fair, even if you don't like the outcome, you must accept it. January 6th was a repudiation of that. At the electoral level, some court decisions now seem to be repudiations of it in the courts. And very clearly, as I indicated, the political elite is seized with expediency rather than principle on many levels. So the political order that we created in 1783 to 1789 is disappearing. And we have social issues of great complexity. We are in many respects a plutocracy more now than we are a democracy. This is dismaying also. Where does this end? I think it ends like the famous phoenix burning up, but then it's reborn. We are a country of enormous, with enormous advantages, 330 million odd population, that population perhaps the most diverse on the planet, the traditions of resilience on the part of that population, two broad oceans protecting us, separating us from the rest of the world. Our neighbors, the Canadians, are excruciatingly polite, delightful people who pose a threat to no one. And the Mexicans are happy-go-lucky and have been cowed into a non-violent approach to us. So I think Otto von Bismarck said that God had blessed the United States of America because to the north, its neighbors were the Canadians, and to the south, the Mexicans, and to the east and west, the neighbors were fish. Well, if you're Germany, that is not a description of your neighbors. So there's something, I think we will be reborn, but in what form, I don't know. So I wouldn't count us out, but I think clearly we are in a state of disintegration. And I wish that could be reversed, but there's no one on the horizon who's, notwithstanding the Make America Great Again slogan, which is a response to this, there's no one on the scene who has a coherent vision of what we should become. I have some ideas, but no one's going to listen to them. And besides that, I'm ancient and about to depart this earth. So I think these are all issues, and they are a problem for the world because the world was, as I indicated earlier, expectant about American leadership, rightly or wrongly. Maybe they didn't like it always, but there was an assumption that the United States would step up and do things, and we're not doing that. We have not responded to the challenges of this Zeitenwende, as Olaf Scholz called it, Wendepunkt, I guess. We're not responding to this as we did after the end of World War II, when we reinvented the world along liberal democratic lines. Whether we stuck with that or not is another issue. But we're not stepping up to this, and nor is Europe. You mentioned defense industries and military-industrial complex. The military-industrial complex in Europe, to a great extent, is fragmented along national lines. And it's one of the reasons for that Europe is much less than the sum of its parts. It should be more. One of the things that Europeans have to do if you are going to take a greater role in your own destiny is come together. If you remain little fractious countries, each one defending its right to produce its own version of some weaponry, I think this is not only inefficient, but it is divisive. And it is one of the reasons, not the only one, that Europe punches below its weight globally. And I think we really should bring this depressing interview to an end. And I again say, I hope you find a nice topic to talk about rather than Ukraine or Israel or whatever. I guess China's not a nice topic now either, but it is, we live in what the British ambassador to China, he was actually the minister because they didn't have an ambassador at the time. British ambassador to China, he was shot by the Japanese who strafed Shanghai with their Zero aircrafts, which were the best in the world at the time. And he was in a hospital for 6 months being patched together. And somebody came to him from the local press and asked him how it was, how was things. And he said, well, we live in interesting times. And that is the origin of the alleged Chinese curse. It's not Chinese at all, doesn't exist in Chinese. It was a typical example of British laconic, taciturn response in a restrained manner to a question that could have caused him to scream. He didn't. He's British, so he stiff upper lip and all that. Anyway, we live in interesting times.
On that note, Ambassador Freeman, thank you so much for your time. It's greatly appreciated. And indeed, we live in interesting times. And I hope that you have many more years left to remain living in these interesting times.
Well, that's kind of you. We'll see.
It was my pleasure talking to you, Ambassador. I wish you all the best.
Thank you, and you too.